welcome you today to the Metropolitan Community Church of Washington, D.C. Spiritual Engagement Hour. It's 9 a.m. Eastern Time where we are, and we know that wherever you are, God is with you. If it's your first time with MCCDC, my name is Dwayne Johnson, the senior pastor, and I welcome you, and I would love to hear from you. My email is revdwayne@mccdc.com. I also bring you greetings today from our associate pastor, Reverend Kathy Alexander. She'd love to hear from you at revkathy@mccdc.com, and that's Kathy with a C. I do bring you again greetings from Reverend Kathy. She is part of our music engagement hour. It's active even as we're having this time together. I also bring you greetings today from two of our regular participants, Dr. Carla Sherrill and our ministry intern, Joanne Ludy. They are also involved in the music engagement hour today. So again, we welcome you. I invite us now to take a moment just to be present, to experience the now moment. We light these candles today to remind us of beloved community, to remind us that we have a God who is creator. We have a Holy Spirit who guides. We have a Christ who saves and leads and loves. I'd like to begin today with a poem by Edwina Gately called Let Your God Love You. Let your God love you. Be silent. Be still. Alone. Empty before your God. Say nothing. Ask nothing. Be silent. Be still. Let your God look upon you. That is all. God knows. God understands. God loves you with an enormous love and only wants to look upon you with that love. Quiet, still, be. Let your God love you. Just breathe in that love, and even at this moment, think of the love of God shining upon you, extending to you. What is love? Love, at its most basic, is to will the best for another. God wants the best for each of us. And God is teaching us to want the best for ourselves and for others. That is love at its most basic. Love is not mostly a feeling. Love is a way of being. And love is acts of goodness and well-being for ourselves and others. Today we're going to continue with the theme of the Serenity Prayer for times such as this. During this particular season, we're called to offer support to each other in the midst of these difficult and painful times, recognizing that countless people are impacted by unjust executive orders and continual threats. We seek to care for others and also for ourselves, and that is love. Last week, we talked about the Serenity Prayer, so this is the second week to go deeper in that prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Last week, we stayed with the concept of surrender and acceptance. This week, we want to spend more time looking at the courage and wisdom. So we just at this time open up to what's on your heart as we think about courage and wisdom, and we'll go into our conversation and share it together. One entry point may be to ask the question on this Passion Palm Sunday, what do the life and teachings of Jesus say about courage? And when you think about courage in Jesus, is there a particular scripture or story that comes up for you that speaks to the courage? And you may have other thoughts or promptings. I wanted to offer an open-ended question to help guide us during this time.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is part 2 of the first conversation that we had about the Serenity Prayer, and I've been thinking about it a lot this week, and I had forgotten that we talked about it last Sunday. So it's a good reminder that the seeds planted. It definitely took root this week. I think the thing that came up for me before you asked the second question was about wisdom and discernment. Like, do I know the wisdom, what stuff to leave alone and what stuff, y- what stuff should I do something about? But also, how do we come to know stuff? Like, I really began to think about how do we become wise? How do we learn things? And that's basically what I wanted to share. That just to say that I was thinking about that, and that um, courage. I know a lot of people that I think of as being very courageous, and I don't know how I feel about that. Sometimes I compare myself, or I wouldn't have the courage to do that, whatever it was that they just did. But I know that there are ways in which I do stuff that when I look back, I think not so much what was I thinking, but I didn't think about any of the risk involved. I was so quick to act, or felt so about like clear about what I had to do. So it began to help me to look at courage a different way. And I think last week I did say that for me, in this serenity prayer, courage to change. It wasn't just like plain old courage. It was, where do I get the courage to change my perspective on things? So thanks. Good to see everybody here. And Palm Sunday. We know how the week ends, but it starts out pretty cool.
Yes, it does. Welcome, Melanie. Welcome, welcome. We're talking today about the Serenity Prayer, especially the part of the prayer that says, give me the courage to change the things I can and the wisdom to know the difference. This is part 2 of a conversation we started last week. Last week, we looked a lot at acceptance, and now we're looking at courage and wisdom. And so one question before us, it ties in with Palm and Passion Sunday, is how did Jesus show courage in his life and ministry? And perhaps what are some of your favorite scriptures or stories or encounters that speak to the courage of Jesus? And I've often believed that one of the greatest signs of spiritual maturity is courage. And as we seek to grow in our faith, that potentially courage begins to grow.
So for me, the courage piece is not so much maybe the courage of Jesus, what came up for me. Last night, I had the pleasure of attending a Passover Seder with friends, and it was a very modern way because it looked at current developments in the world and how we each have a role to play to connect the story from the Exodus to make it relevant for today. And one element that I had forgotten, although I'm still part of the B90 group and we just read this a couple of weeks ago, is when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. The promise of God was, I'll lead you safely out through the Red Sea, but somebody had to take the first step. The waters didn't just part when the Israelites came to the shore. Somebody actually had to walk into the water until that happened.
Mhm.
And so, based on the story, it was Nahshon. And so, although that promise was there, somebody had to have the courage to lean into that promise and take that step. And it's not just, putting your toe in. I think he had to go all the way up to his nose.
Mhm.
And so this kind of trust and courage at the same time that then allowed others to follow. That's something that came up in the courage piece. And
Yeah,
and I had forgotten about that detail of the story, which it wasn't as present to me, but it came up last night. And so
yeah,
I had to think of that piece of courage.
yeah. Yeah, there's powerful versions of that story. One that you just shared is that the waters didn't start to part until the water got up to the neck. The other piece is that others linked arms, and that was also a part of the courage. It ended up not being just courage on his own, but the linking of arms with others, and they were all kind of up to their chin until the water started to part. So in some of the variations of that story, and how that story has developed over time, as the story has been told and imagined and reimagined. So, welcome, Sarah. We're doing the second and third parts of the Serenity Prayer, courage and wisdom. And so we're looking at perhaps how Jesus modeled courage, if there's a place where you've seen that, or there may be somebody else who really inspires you to courage. It could be a contemporary person, or with this being our anniversary Sunday, I can't help but remember the Courageous 12, who had our very first gathering. We weren't yet officially a chartered congregation, but 12 people who gathered on Capitol Hill. It's number 12 comes up, and that was back when homosexuality was considered both a sin and a sickness. And many of them were people who were no longer welcome in their communities of faith. And that group, when they gathered, had no way of knowing what they were becoming a part of. Some courage or wisdom. Perhaps how do courage and wisdom go together? Jackie Lewis already kind of alluded to that, mentioned that.
Like the story that you both told, one about attending the Seder, one about being standing at Capitol Hill. I think there's a period of time where you potentially have a chance to think about what it is that you're getting ready to do or say or be. And that's one period. That's the whole wisdom discernment thing. But then there's the look back, where I look back and see, what did I do? What happened? Or you'll tell someone the story and they'll say, were you crazy? You shouldn't have done that, or I wouldn't have done that. So I think there's a lot packed into that prayer,
Mhm.
to give you not just a moment of pause, but like you said, what are the times that you felt that you've been courageous? Maybe you didn't see yourself as courageous and somebody else told you that you were courageous. And this week I've been wondering about courage to change my attitudes, change how I view things, change how I respond in certain situation. That's a lot of kind of mental and spiritual activity, but it's focused on the wisdom part. How will I know how to act? I mean, I know the situation's coming up, and how am I going to act differently? And
Mhm.
I think last week we spoke about my first introduction to the Serenity Prayer was in 12-step programs, and the prayer was an invitation to people who typically didn't pray, and an invitation to people to say, "Can you change your ideas or can you change your behavior? You don't have to do it right now, but you might want to consider given addiction or given the spiritually just kind of bankrupt place that you're in, will you consider praying? Will you consider thinking about changing? Just a possibility, a willingness, a surrender um to changing."
Mhm. So how do we have the courage to change or the courage? What are some of the ways, the hows of that? What are some of our practices that can build courage? One thing that I do when I'm going into a situation that requires courage is I think of courageous people who have been in similar situations, and I call on them to actually stand with me in that. So there was a very difficult meeting recently that was potentially very pivotal. There was a lot of energy. There was a lot of differences in approach, differences in styles, differences in belief. So it was a very high stakes kind of meeting. And so I thought, it's going to take some courage to facilitate this, and to facilitate it with courage. And so I called on one of my mentors who has since passed, Reverend Arlene Ackerman. She used to be the district coordinator for the Mid-Atlantic region of MCC. She was a former pastor of our church in Minneapolis, and she later became an elder in our denomination. And she's one of those persons who could walk into any situation with a smile, not a fake smile, but a smile that came from a very deep place. And she just had a way of extending this presence that she could really address the situation in a way that was professional, loving, and healthy with a deep sense of calm. And so I just said, I called her Arlene. I said, Arlene, need you here today. Come alongside. And in that meeting, I actually several times imagined her when I felt my energy going up, or I wasn't sure what to say, or when I was finding myself unclear. I almost felt her touch on my shoulder, like a gentle touch, like, you've got this, we've got this. You, me, and God, we've got this. So that's one practice I do that I started doing more and more is thinking of those kinds of folks, asking God to show me who might be of help in that situation. So that's one practice. Things that you all have used to help you with courage. I know we've all faced situations where we've been asked, to be courageous. Things that have helped you.
I love that example. Um, Thank you for bringing it up, Pastor, that there are people that inspire us, either consciously or unconsciously. But I liked the way you told the story about how you watched how Arlene behaved. and maybe it was different than how you would normally behave, but you called on her. You called on her spirit. You called on her as an elder, as an ancestor. But the part I really loved about the story is that you had a chance to witness for yourself that she acted differently, or she acted in a way that you would like to act in that situation. And you actually felt her presence. In Bible study Tuesday night, we talked about Jesus' presence, just like, how do you, how do you know God's there? How do you know Jesus is there? How do you know someone is with you and that you're not alone, and that does inspire you, and that does give you uh, courage, or just a model. I think a lot of us have never seen a model of how things would look, how things would change. Just never seen it. Mm.
Yes.
Yeah, I like, oh, sorry, Jackie.
No, I was just gonna say, now I wanna read more or find out more about Arlene. I've heard about her, but now you're making me curious about her, and I wanna learn more about the women at MCC. I wanna learn more about the elders, and just like I know she'll inspire me.
Yes. Another one for you to do a little work on is Reverend Elder Frida Smith. She was really one of the very first strong voices, and our bylaws when they were first founded were male dominated, and you might would suspect were quite patriarchal. And so she went through in a business meeting, went through every pronoun, every word that had male hierarchy, and she made a motion to change. And she went completely changed. That was very courageous at that time. That would have been probably founded in 68. That probably would have been 72, 74, somewhere in there. That she stood for that, and she was one of the first voices for expansive and including language. And it was a long business meeting, but it passed. So Frida Smith, her most famous sermon is called Purple Grass. And it was about a little lamb that was bullied by all the other lambs because this little lamb liked purple grass. And you can kind of imagine the story. But she told it in a powerful and beautiful way. You were getting ready to say something, Sarah.
Oh, I was just thinking about like what you said, Jackie Lowe's, about having a model. And it reminded me of sometimes if I need courage, I like to imagine, like I try to have secure attachment with myself or with my higher self. So it's like a toddler who's like leaving their parent, and then they turn around and they're like, oh my God, are you still here? Am I okay? And then they go a little further and then they're like, oh wait, are you still here? Like that's courageous for them. So I think, because a lot of times my instinct is to try to avoid the anxiety I feel about whatever I need to be courageous about and push it away, but I've learned that really doesn't work at all. And it's actually like if I were the parent, like, and I would just leave the toddler all alone. That's like what's happening internally if I do that. So I try to welcome the anxious part or the fearful part and say, okay, listen, even if it doesn't go well, do your best and I'll be here for you, even if it goes horribly. And then I try to actually be true to that and actually be there for my parts, even if my anxiety, my shame, if I mess something up that required courage, and say, hey, that still took a lot of courage and I'm still proud of you.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's hard to access that that's part of why I love just. I used to be involved in Buddhism for a long time, and I just was being called back to Christianity over and over. And part of it is because I always felt like I can rely on God, and there's something there, I can invite that spirit into me, so I'm not alone in providing that attachment for myself. It's like God is my attachment figure then,
Yeah,
in those moments when I'm like, oh my God, I really need help, you know, I'm so scared to do this thing. Yeah.
Well, I so appreciate what you just said because, I mean, I just think it's brilliant. Plus, the idea that one of the parts of discernment and wisdom is that on some level, you called on this notion that people are watching me. I'm being watched. And it didn't make you more fearful, but maybe it made you mindful or awareness that I, just like other people have been models for me, what if I could be a model for somebody else? Whether it's a toddler or someone the same age or someone who's older, that you're being held up as a light for someone else. So I I think that's another aspect that I have had people in my life that have said to me, "You're being watched here. You may not be aware of it, but act like you know what you're doing and act like you're representing for other people." So I think that's really cool. But I wonder where that came from, because clearly you demonstrated that here, but that's something that I don't think we're always aware of. Did Arlene know that you were watching her? And did that give her courage and strength to do things that were difficult? And the other thing, I had just made a note about Frida Smith. Today, there's a group called, it's actually an archive, and they're honoring Frida Smith today. Her interviews, her life, her role in MCC. And as I was reading some of their stuff, there was a lot of things. Not only did I learn about her, but I learned about the denomination. And she spoke about her childhood, wherever they grew up. I think she was like Nazarene or some denomination that I'm still learning about, but she was saying that in her particular town, that they were, whatever had happened made her prepared for the role that she would then later take in MCC, whether it was a role as a woman, as an elder, as a clergy, and how she confronted that because of previous experiences. She was prepared for that. So her name is Frida Smith, if you guys would like to look her up. And she's actually being honored today as a part of the archival experience, keeping the history.
So how can we watch that? Or is it online? Do you know?
I think so. I'll see if I can put it in a chat or your email or something. I'll send it to you. Um, but her witness, um, and some of her sermons are already in that archive because people are collecting it. She wasn't always really welcome, and maybe Reverend Dwayne can tell us more about that. Uh,
well, because she pushed against, she came from a place, we were built on the margins. And then sometimes when people organize from the margins, they want to protect what center they have. And so she came from even further from the margins. So, I mean, I've seen that so many times. I mean, at MCC, I'm gonna be very honest, at MCCDC, when, I mean, we would have, people who had an issue, had challenges around the transgender community and pronouns. So we've needed to continue to work. We still do. We continue to have to work on that. So it's almost like people who've been decentered, when they get a little bit of center, they try to protect it. And so with Elder Frida Smith, when she came in and called for expansive language, inclusive language, called for the dismantling of patriarchy. She faced a lot of resistance. It was not always welcome. It was not always welcome in all the pulpits because she would always continue to push those issues. And there were some people who wanted MCC basically to be like their own previous denomination, but just accepting of LGBTQIA people. So you had people of all kinds of backgrounds where the leadership in that church would basically sort of create a Baptist church that was fully accepting it, but they kept all the other stuff, Catholic, Methodist. Oftentimes you'd see MCC congregations that were kind of the image of their founding pastor. And the only thing that made them different from their previous church was being, and sometimes just gay friendly, not even necessarily lesbian, bisexual, transgender. So you see, you had some congregations, for example, that were like 90% lesbian and others that were 90% gay white men. So there's a lot of this stuff through the years that congregations have needed to work through and still are working. We're not perfect. I'm not going to say we are. We've still got a lot of work to do at MCCDC. And the other thing about Reverend Elder Frida Smith is she's kept a lot of her evangelical flavor. Because she did come from a combination of Church of the Nazarene as well as a Salvation Army background. And so she had quite a bit of evangelical theology and flavor about her. And that was welcome in some places, but resisted in others. So. Courage is never a once and done. It's.
And that gets, to me, that gets into the wisdom part, because sometimes it's like, it's so difficult to discern what the right path is. The courage, the wisdom to know the difference.
Yeah.
Not just in when to change, but how specifically to change.
Yeah.
Like, especially when it's like, we are here together organizing politically, and there's different paths for how to be the most effective. And it's really hard to know. I mean, I know I'm not, you know, I don't even know, a political scientist or anything like that. Or so sometimes I'm like, what actually produces change? Like, I know what I believe, what I feel, but what actually produces change in the world, that gets really murky.
Yeah. There's a link there.
Thank you.
So, yeah. And I think part of the response to that question is somewhere, it goes back to the story that you shared. It's somehow it's the linking of arms. And there's a place where you need to get a kind of a tipping point. You know, one person can do so much and make an impact, two or three, but there's a certain point where it becomes more of a revolution or a movement. And it maybe starts with one or two or three, but at some point it builds. And there's actually been, I don't have the information, I don't want to tear this up, but there's been research on that, about how many it takes. If there's 100 people, and I forget who did the research and how they set up the experiment. In that particular case, to change the mindset of 100 people, it was something over 10 that needed to shift before the rest of the group started to shift. But they had specific research and numbers about the actual number of people. They came up with some kind of experiment, set up the parameters, and then did research on that. It's not real helpful to describe something I can't give you the actual, but I just read it this
That was
week.
out there,
It's
yeah.
out there. I just read that this week. It's talking about how groups change and how many people in the group does it take before the change really begins to happen. Yeah.
That reminds me of something else that is part of the P90 that I read about Paul and, kind of the new movement of the way in Christianity that try to appeal to Jewish faith leaders and people who were uncomfortable with the change. And the way I read the story is that, when Paul was able to not only signal, okay, I'm a credentialed Jewish leader, I know where you're coming from. There's kind of this idea, it's not just something completely new, it's actually grounded in something that you're all very familiar with. And then kind of laid out where that path is that led to the change. And then people understood and were able to buy in, so to speak. So it wasn't something completely new. The change wasn't, something that was coming out of the blue. It was anchored in something that people felt familiar with in a way. So I think that is also a good reminder to, when you want to enact change, get people from where they are, because that helps them to see the path to where you want them to go. Otherwise, it's all very abstract or kind of, easier met with resistance. So that it's another element I just thought of when you shared that.
I think that's a really good example on so many levels, Knut, that, Paul wrote letters, before Paul was Saul, and then he wrote letters, and then he wrote letters in different languages, whether it was Greek or Roman or whoever he was talking to. He knew the language that Jesus spoke. He knew people who wrote about Jesus. But if I'm going to have a new audience, I have to remind people Jesus was a nice Jewish boy. this is the language that he spoke. This is this form of Hebrew. Now I'm going to be talking to you in Greek, or I'm going to be writing this letter to you, in another language. And I know I don't look like I know I'm in jail, and I know that you shouldn't necessarily believe me because my situation's not so hot. So this kind of level of honesty and a willingness to speak in another language. And then, what Reverend Dwayne was saying about there's a tipping point. I've heard people say, oh, this is a transgender church, or this is a gay church. This is whatever. This is too much, too many Black people in this church. I need classical. I need, whatever. And I think that our ability to not only welcome those questions, but to give people a space where they can say, oh, this is too much. How much is too much? And to have that conversation rather than just showing people the door. Can we be a model, an example for, how many is too many? Like integration's okay, except I'm not going to send my kid to that school if there's too many of those people, or too many immigrants, too many. I mean, this is a huge concept that we struggle with, and hopefully don't abandon our principles. But this idea of centering, like you said, you got pushed out of the church because you were gay, but then you're going to create a church that was just as harmful as the one you just left, and wonder why people are crying. So this is something that I think we've been working at for 54 years now, and we're going to continue to work with it. And I think that there are people, we have so many witnesses of people who've said, oh, we got through this part, and this is how we did it, and I'm still here, or I left, or I came back, or so. How do we show compassion?
Mhm. Yes. Thank you all. Yeah. You always bring so much to these conversations, and we're grateful for those who will view later on demand. And we'll continue to work on this idea of courage and what it means for us individually, as well as what it means for the different organizations we're a part of, to show that collective courage as a body. So again, thank you for this time. We invite you to join us 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time, online, on site, or on demand, as we have our 54th anniversary celebration today, as well as Palm and Passion Sunday. And so today, one thing we'll be doing at the 10:30 service today is honoring Esther Smith. She reached the 50-year mark of her membership this year. And her story is also one of courage and the influence she had on MCCDC back when we were in in a very difficult place in terms of where we were going to spiritually locate as well as culturally locate. She was a very powerful voice in those days. And to this day, she is not afraid of asking courageous questions. So she's planning on being here. I didn't get a chance to call her Friday, and she's planning on being here. Her health is a little up and down, so she's not able to be with us on site today. We'll hopefully have her with us next week for Easter Sunday, and we'll honor her then. But today, her hope is to be here, and so we're looking forward to that. All right, go in love, grace, and peace. Amen.